"Are you sure you're in the right place, sir?" The question hung in the air, sharp and coated in a thin veneer of politeness that did nothing to hide its condescending sting. Donald Harris, 81 years old, didn't look up from his menu. He had heard tones like that before, in countless places over countless years. It was the sound of youthful certainty, of someone who judged the value of a book by its worn and faded cover. He simply traced a finger down the list of sandwiches, his knuckles swollen with age, his skin a roadmap of a life lived outdoors, under harsh suns and unforgiving skies. The waitress, a young woman with a name tag that read Chloe, tapped a perfectly manicured nail against her notepad. The click, click, click was a tiny, impatient drumbeat in the otherwise calm ambiance of the Oak and Anchor bistro. "It's just that we have a certain clientele," she added, her eyes sweeping over Donald's simple flannel shirt and worn denim jeans. "Our lunch menu is a bit pricey." Donald finally lifted his gaze. His eyes were a pale, clear blue, the color of a winter sky. They held no anger, no defensiveness, only a quiet, unnerving stillness. He had seen men crumble under that placid gaze, but Chloe only saw an old man who was taking too long to order. "The Turkey Club sounds fine," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "And a black coffee, please." Chloe's lips tightened into a small, disapproving line. She scribbled the order down with a flourish of annoyance. "Of course," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness as she turned and walked away, her hips swaying with a self-assured rhythm. Donald watched her go, then turned his attention to the window, observing the lazy afternoon traffic. He hadn't come here for the ambiance or the pricey sandwiches. He had come here because it was quiet, and on this particular day he needed quiet. The anniversary was always the hardest. He absently rubbed his left forearm, his fingers tracing the familiar jagged lines of puckered flesh that crisscrossed the skin. They were old wounds, silvered with age, but on days like today, they ached with the memory of fire and steel. The bistro was moderately busy, filled with the gentle clinking of silverware and the low murmur of conversations. A family at a nearby table, a mother and father with 2 young children, occasionally glanced in his direction. The mother's gaze was wary, as if his quiet presence was a disruption to their carefully curated afternoon. Donald paid them no mind. He was an island of stillness in a sea of polite society. When Chloe returned with his coffee, she placed it on the table with a little more force than necessary, sloshing a dark ring onto the crisp white saucer. "Your sandwich will be out shortly," she announced, already looking past him toward a group of businessmen who had just been seated. As she turned to leave, her eyes fell on his forearm, where his sleeve had ridden up slightly. A look of genuine disgust flickered across her face. "Goodness," she said, her voice a stage whisper loud enough for the nearby tables to hear. "What on earth happened to you?" The murmur of conversation around them faltered. The father at the next table stopped mid-sentence. The air grew thick with a sudden uncomfortable silence. Donald didn't flinch. He slowly pulled his sleeve down, covering the scars from view. "An old argument," he said softly. Chloe let out a small, disbelieving laugh. "Well, it looks like you lost. We do try to maintain a certain standard of decorum here, sir. Maybe you could keep that covered." The request was so far beyond the pale of common decency that it seemed to hang in the air, shimmering with its own ugliness. Donald felt a familiar coldness settle deep in his gut, a feeling he hadn't experienced in decades. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was the profound weariness of having to explain his existence to people who couldn't possibly understand it. Before he could respond, a man in a tailored suit approached their table. He had a nervous energy about him, his name tag identifying him as Mr. Henderson, the manager. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his eyes darting from Chloe to Donald. "This gentleman was just showing me his very graphic injuries," Chloe said, playing the victim with practiced ease. "It's a bit much for a lunch setting, don't you think?" Mr. Henderson wrung his hands, his professional smile strained. "Sir," he began, his voice placating, "perhaps it would be best if we try not to disturb the other guests." "I haven't said a word," Donald stated, his voice still level, still quiet. But the tide of opinion had already turned against him. The mother at the next table was now whispering to her husband, her hand shielding her children's eyes as if Donald were some sort of grotesque exhibit. The humiliation was a physical thing, a heavy cloak settling over his shoulders. He was no longer a customer, he was a problem to be managed. "I think," Mr. Henderson said, his courage bolstered by Chloe's smug expression and the silent judgment of his other patrons, "it would be best if you settled for your coffee and left." He gestured vaguely toward the door. "We'll even comp the drink. Please, just go quietly." The word quietly was the final insult. Donald Harris had spent a lifetime moving quietly, a ghost in the shadows, a whisper in the dark. He had been quiet in jungles so dense the sun was a rumor. He had been quiet on shores so black you couldn't see your own hand. He had been quiet as he held dying friends, their last breaths silenced by the roar of battle. To be told to go quietly from a bistro by a man in a cheap suit was an irony so bitter it almost made him smile. As the manager spoke, Donald's gaze unfocused for just a moment. The scent of coffee and baked bread faded, replaced by the sharp metallic tang of cordite and the salty humidity of a mangrove swamp. The polite clinking of cutlery became the sharp crack of rifle fire. The jagged silver lines on his arm burned with a phantom heat, a memory of searing shrapnel tearing through flesh and sinew. He saw the face of a young corpsman, barely 20, his hands slick with Donald's own blood as he worked frantically under the chaotic strobing of muzzle flashes. He felt a brother's hand grip his shoulder, a voice cutting through the din. "Stay with me, Donnie. Stay with me." It was not a memory of defeat, as the waitress had so casually suggested. It was a memory of survival, of sacrifice, of a bond forged in the crucible of absolute terror. The memory receded as quickly as it came, leaving him back in the brightly lit restaurant, the target of whispers and wary stares. He blinked, the pale blue of his eyes as clear and calm as ever. He had made his decision. He would not make a scene. He would simply leave. But across the room, another pair of eyes had seen everything. At a small table in the corner sat a man in his late 30s. He was dressed in civilian clothes, a simple polo shirt and jeans, but he sat with a ramrod straight posture that no civilian could ever quite master. His hair was cut short, his jaw was set, and his eyes, a deep, piercing hazel, missed nothing. He had watched the entire exchange, his food forgotten on his plate. He had seen the waitress's sneer, the manager's cowardice, and the old man's unshakable dignity. But he had seen something else too. As the manager gestured for Donald to leave, the old man had reached into his pocket to pull out his wallet to pay for the coffee he wouldn't drink. The movement was slight, but it was enough. The flannel sleeve, the one he had so carefully pulled down, hitched up again, just for a second. It rode up past the scars, past the watch on his wrist, to a small patch of skin just below his elbow. And there, faded by decades of sun and salt water but still unmistakably clear, was a tattoo. It wasn't a flashy piece of art. It was small, discreet, and deadly serious. A skull, wreathed in serpents, with a trident rising behind it. The man in the corner felt the breath catch in his throat. His blood ran cold. It wasn't just a seal trident. It was older, a specific variant, the insignia of a unit that existed more in whispered legends than in official records, a ghost team from a forgotten war. His name was Lieutenant Commander Marcus Thorne, and he was on a short leave from his post at the nearby Naval Special Warfare Command. He knew that tattoo, he knew the stories, he knew the impossible, horrifying and heroic history it represented. The man being thrown out of a bistro for the crime of being old and scarred wasn't just any veteran. Marcus's hand went to his phone, his movement swift and economical. He didn't rise to confront the manager. A public shouting match would only further humiliate the old man. This required a different response. This required a level of respect that a sniveling restaurant manager couldn't even begin to comprehend. He found the number in his contacts and pressed call. His thumb tapped an impatient rhythm on the table as he waited for the other end to pick up. "Command duty officer," a crisp voice answered. "This is Lieutenant Commander Thorne," Marcus said, his voice low and urgent, pitched just above a whisper. "Patch me through to the base commander's office. Priority 1. This is not a drill." There was a moment of surprised silence, then a click. Marcus Thorne didn't use phrases like Priority 1 lightly. A new voice, that of an aide, came on the line. "Commander's office. What's your traffic? I need to speak with Captain Whitmore." "Now," Marcus insisted. "Tell her it's about Operation Serpent's Tooth." Another pause, longer this time, charged with significance. That was a name from the deep archives, a file sealed with classifications most of the modern Navy had never even heard of. "Stand by, Commander." As he waited, Marcus watched Donald Harris slowly, deliberately place a $5 bill on the table to cover the coffee. The old man was preparing to make his quiet exit, his dignity battered but intact. The manager, Mr. Henderson, hovered nearby, eager to see him gone. The waitress, Chloe, was already wiping down a different table, a smug smile playing on her lips. They had no idea what was coming. They couldn't possibly know. They were ants mocking a sleeping giant, and Marcus Thorne had just kicked the anthill. The scene cut to a sterile, sunlit office overlooking the naval base. Polished wood, brass plaques, and framed photographs of warships adorned the walls. Behind a large desk sat Captain Sarah Whitmore, a woman whose sharp, intelligent features were framed by a severe bun of dark hair. Her uniform was immaculate, the silver eagle on her collar gleaming. She was in the middle of a logistics briefing, her expression one of focused impatience, when her aide entered without knocking. "Ma'am," he said, his voice tight with urgency. "Priority 1 call from Lieutenant Commander Thorne. He's downtown." He mentioned Operation Serpent's Tooth. Whitmore's head snapped up. Her pen froze mid-signature. The name was a ghost, a piece of classified history spoken only in hushed tones by the old guard. It predated her own service, but she knew the legend. She had read the sealed after-action reports, the ones that were more myth than military doctrine. "Put him through," she commanded, waving the logistics officers out of her office. They scrambled to leave, sensing the sudden seismic shift in the atmosphere. She picked up the receiver. "Whitmore." "Ma'am, it's Thorne." Marcus's voice came through, tight and controlled. "I'm at the Oak and Anchor Bistro on Main Street. You are not going to believe who I am looking at right now, and you're not going to believe how he's being treated." "Who is it, Commander?" Whitmore asked, her voice dangerously calm. "It's him, ma'am. The legend himself. Donald Harris. Master Chief Harris. They're throwing him out." Captain Whitmore's back went ramrod straight. The blood drained from her face, replaced by a flush of disbelief, then incandescent fury. Donald Harris, the lead operator from Serpent's Tooth, the man credited with saving an entire platoon in a single night of unimaginable violence. A man most of the command thought had died years ago. She didn't hesitate. "Keep eyes on him, Thorne. Do not let him leave. Do not engage. I am on my way." She slammed the phone down and hit the intercom on her desk. "Get me my vehicle and a full dress uniform honor guard. Now, and get the Master Chief of the command on the line. Tell him we've found a ghost." Back in the restaurant, the final act of the petty drama was playing out. Donald Harris stood up, his joints protesting with a quiet creak. He adjusted his flannel shirt and looked at Mr. Henderson, his gaze empty of malice. He was about to turn toward the door, a silent, forgotten soldier fading away once more. But Mr. Henderson, puffed up with his small victory, couldn't resist a final jab. He felt the eyes of his patrons on him and mistook their shocked silence for approval. "And if I see you loitering around here again," he said, his voice loud and needlessly cruel, "I won't hesitate to call the police. Men like you can be unstable. We'll have you evaluated." The threat to have him declared mentally incompetent, a final stripping of his agency and dignity, was the ultimate overreach. It was the moment he and Chloe crossed a line from mere rudeness into profound, unforgivable disrespect. It was at that exact moment that the sound began. It started as a low, distant hum, a vibration felt more than heard. It grew rapidly into a deep, authoritative siren, not the frantic yelp of a police car, but the powerful, chest-rattling whoop of a military escort. Heads in the restaurant turned toward the windows. 2 black SUVs, sleek and imposing, swept to the curb, followed by a larger van. They parked with military precision, boxing in the entrance. Doors opened in unison, and uniformed men and women began to disembark. They were not police. They were sailors, Marines, all in their immaculate dress uniforms, blues and whites so crisp they seemed to cut the air. They moved with a disciplined, intimidating purpose, forming a silent 2-lined cordon from the curb to the restaurant's front door. The patrons of the Oak and Anchor were on their feet now, pressing against the glass, their phones already out and recording. Chloe stood frozen, a dirty rag in her hand, her mouth agape. Mr. Henderson's face had gone a pasty, sickly white. The rear door of the lead SUV opened. Out stepped Captain Sarah Whitmore. The afternoon sun glinted off the polished brim of her hat and the rows of ribbons on her chest. She was the very picture of authority, her expression a mask of cold, controlled fury. She strode through the honor guard, her black shoes clicking a sharp, rhythmic cadence on the pavement. She entered the bistro, and a wave of silence followed her. The air crackled with tension. She ignored the manager, the waitress, and the gawking crowd. Her eyes, sharp as a hawk's, scanned the room for only one person. She found him, Donald Harris, standing by his table, looking as bewildered by the sudden spectacle as everyone else. Captain Whitmore marched directly toward him. The entire restaurant held its breath. When she was 3 feet away from him, she stopped. Her back straightened, her arms snapped up in a salute so sharp, so precise it seemed to slice the air. It was a gesture of profound, absolute respect. Her voice when she spoke was a commander's voice. It was clear, unwavering, and loud enough for every single person in that room to hear every single word. "Master Chief Petty Officer Harris," she said, her eyes locked on his. "It is an honor, sir." Donald stared at her, his pale blue eyes wide with confusion. "Ma'am," he managed, the title an old ingrained reflex. Whitmore did not lower her salute. Her gaze was intense, reverent. "Donald Harris, Master Chief Petty Officer, retired," she announced to the stunned room. "United States Navy SEALs, 50 years of active and reserve service, veteran of 3 wars." She paused, letting the weight of the words sink in. Mr. Henderson looked like he was about to faint. Chloe's face was a mess of confusion and dawning horror. "Recipient of the Navy Cross," Whitmore continued, her voice ringing with pride, "for extraordinary heroism during Operation Serpent's Tooth. Recipient of the Silver Star for gallantry in action. 2 Bronze Stars with Valor. 3 Purple Hearts for wounds received in combat against the enemy." She took a half-step closer, her eyes dropping for a moment to his scarred forearm, now visible again. "Wounds," she said, her voice dropping slightly but losing none of its power, "earned while single-handedly defending a compromised extraction point for 6 hours, allowing for the safe evacuation of his entire platoon. An act of valor so profound it has been a required case study at Annapolis for the last 30 years. The collective gasp in the room was audible. The mother who had shielded her children's eyes now had her hand over her own mouth, her eyes filled with tears of shame and awe. The other patrons were no longer just recording, they were watching a living piece of history, a legend they had, moments before, judged and dismissed. Finally, Whitmore lowered her hand. She turned her head slowly, her icy gaze falling upon Mr. Henderson. "This man," she said, her voice now dangerously soft, "has withstood more pain, shown more courage, and sacrificed more for his country than you could possibly comprehend in 1,000 lifetimes. His presence doesn't lower the standard of your establishment. It is the highest honor this building has ever received. Your conduct and that of your staff has been a profound disgrace." Mr. Henderson began to stammer, a string of incoherent apologies spilling from his trembling lips. Chloe stood as if turned to stone, her face ashen. But then, a quiet voice cut through the tension. "Captain." It was Donald. He had placed a gentle, weathered hand on Whitmore's perfectly starched sleeve. "It's all right, Captain. They didn't know." Whitmore looked down at the old hero, her hard expression softening with respect. "Respect," Donald said, his voice calm and steady, "for all to hear, isn't about the medals on your chest or the scars on your skin. It's about seeing the person standing in front of you and affording them their dignity. It's a lesson we all have to learn, sometimes more than once." His eyes met Chloe's for a brief moment. There was no anger in them, only a deep, abiding sadness. He had seen the best and the worst of humanity, and this, he knew, was just another small, sad part of it. Whitmore's gaze followed his, landing on the faded tattoo on his arm. For a second, a different image flashed through her mind, one built from the classified files she knew by heart. A younger Donald, barely 30, caked in mud and blood in a humid jungle clearing. A brother in arms using a makeshift needle and ink made from gunpowder and ash, carefully etching the serpent and trident into his skin. It wasn't a decoration. It was a pact, a symbol of a bond forged in hellfire, a permanent reminder of the men who fought beside him and the ones who never came home. Captain Whitmore nodded slowly, understanding his grace. She turned back to Mr. Henderson. "The Naval Command maintains a list of recommended off-base establishments for our thousands of personnel and their families," she stated, her voice returning to its official, chilling tone. "Consider that list under immediate review." It was a quiet, devastating blow, a promise of financial ruin delivered with military precision. She then turned back to Donald. "Master Chief, we came to escort you. We're holding a luncheon in your honor back at the base. The new generation of SEAL candidates needs to meet a real hero." Donald Harris looked around the silent, shamed restaurant. A small, weary smile touched his lips. "Well," he said, "I was just hoping for a turkey club, but I suppose a luncheon would be nice too." The fallout for the Oak and Anchor was swift and silent. Within a week, their lunchtime business had all but vanished. The story, fueled by a dozen cell phone videos, had gone viral in the local community. A formal letter of apology was sent from the restaurant's corporate ownership, along with notice that Mr. Henderson had been terminated and Chloe was on indefinite leave. A mandatory veteran sensitivity training program was instituted for all staff. About a month later, Donald Harris was in the produce section of a local grocery store, carefully selecting a ripe tomato. He heard a hesitant voice behind him. "Mr. Harris?" He turned to see Chloe. She was out of her waitress uniform, dressed in a simple sweatshirt and jeans. She looked younger, smaller, and her eyes were red-rimmed. I just wanted to say I'm sorry," she whispered, twisting the handle of her shopping basket. "There's no excuse for how I acted. It was cruel and ignorant, and I am so sorry." Donald looked at her for a long moment. He saw not a villain, but a young woman who had made a terrible mistake and was now living with the consequences. He offered her a gentle smile. "We all have our bad days," he said, his voice kind. The important thing is what we learn from them and what we do on the good ones that follow. He held out the tomato he had picked. The secret is to find one that's firm, but not hard, and it should smell like the sun. Chloe looked at the tomato, then back at his face, at the pale blue eyes that held no judgment, only forgiveness. A single tear traced a path down her cheek. It was a small moment of grace in a grocery aisle, a quiet lesson in humanity from a man who had seen the very worst of it and had somehow, miraculously, chosen to remember the best. The story of Donald Harris serves as a powerful reminder that heroes don't always wear uniforms or announce their presence. They walk among us every day, bearing the quiet weight of their service in the lines on their faces and the scars on their skin. Their valor isn't a story from the past, it's a living part of our community. If this story moved you, please give it a like, share it with others, and subscribe to Veteran Valor for more incredible stories of our nation's unassuming heroes.